Imagine standing on the shore of the Pacific Ocean at midnight, the largest body of water on Earth, stretching before you into absolute darkness. 64 million square miles of water, so deep that Mount Everest could vanish beneath its surface with a mile of ocean still above its peak. The waves that break at your feet have traveled thousands of miles, carrying with them secrets from the deepest trenches on the planet. Now imagine that same ocean, but 12,000 years ago. The water level 400 feet lower, coastlines extending for hundreds of miles beyond where they are today, and scattered across this vast basin, according to legend, a land, not small islands like we see now, but a continent, larger than Australia, stretching from Hawaii to Easter Island, from the Philippines nearly to the coast of South America. A paradise of rolling plains and mighty rivers, home to 64 million souls who lived in magnificent cities and possessed knowledge that rivaled the gods themselves. Then one night, one terrible night, the earth opened beneath them. Volcanoes erupted in a ring of fire around the entire Pacific basin, and the ocean, that giver of life, became an executioner. In a single catastrophic event, the entire continent collapsed into the abyss. 64 million people gone, an entire civilization erased. The greatest catastrophe in human history, forgotten by everyone except those who preserve it in myth. This is the legend of Lemuria, also called Mu, the motherland of humanity, the lost Pacific continent that supposedly vanished beneath the waves, leaving behind only scattered islands as proof it ever existed. Welcome to Simply About Earth, where we explore the stories that time has tried to erase. Before we dive into tonight's mystery, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing how far our community reaches across this beautiful planet we share. The question we're asking tonight is simple and profound. Did Lemuria exist? And if it didn't, why does the legend persist with such power across cultures and centuries? Why are we so drawn to stories of lost continents and drowned civilizations? What psychological need does this myth fulfill, and what might it actually be remembering? Because here's what makes this story fascinating. While the literal continent of Lemuria almost certainly never existed where the legends place it, the idea of vast inhabited lands being swallowed by rising seas is absolutely historically, scientifically true. It happened, not in a single night, but over thousands of years at the end of the last ice age. And the people who experienced that slow catastrophe, who watched their world shrink year by year, generation by generation, they told stories, they preserved memories, and over millennia, those memories transformed into something larger, something mythic. So tonight we're going on a journey, not to find a sunken continent, but to understand what Lemuria really represents, to trace the origins of the legend, to explore what actually lies beneath the Pacific, and to discover what this enduring myth tells us about ourselves. The story begins not in the Pacific, not in ancient times, but in Victorian England with a mystery about lemurs. Yes, lemurs, those wide-eyed primates native to Madagascar. In the 1860s, zoologists faced a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. Lemur fossils were found in Madagascar and in India, but nowhere in between. How did the same animals end up on both sides of the Indian Ocean, separated by thousands of miles of open water? The theory of evolution was still new, still controversial. Continental drift wouldn't be proposed for another 50 years. Plate tectonics was completely unknown. Scientists were working with incomplete knowledge, trying to explain patterns they could observe, but not yet understand. In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater proposed what seemed like a brilliant solution. There must have been a land bridge, or perhaps even a small continent, connecting Madagascar and India, a landmass that had since sunk beneath the waves. He called this hypothetical land Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution it would explain. It was a reasonable hypothesis, given the knowledge of the time. Land bridges and sunken continents seemed not only possible but necessary to explain the puzzling distribution of species around the world. Other scientists embraced the idea. The renowned German biologist Ernst Haeckel went even further, suggesting that Lemuria might have been the cradle of human evolution itself, the birthplace of our species before we spread to other continents. For a brief period in the late 19th century, Lemuria was serious science. It appeared in textbooks. It was discussed at academic conferences. It seemed to solve real problems in biogeography and evolutionary theory. But then something remarkable happened. The idea escaped from scientific journals, leaped over the walls of academia, and took on a life of its own in the public imagination. And the person most responsible for this transformation, for turning Lemuria from a scientific hypothesis into a legendary lost civilization, was a man named James Churchward. Churchward claimed that in the 1880s, while stationed in India as a young British officer, he befriended a temple priest who showed him something extraordinary. Ancient tablets, hidden away in a secret chamber, written in a language so old that only 2 other men in all of India could still read it. The priest called this language Naga Maya, the original tongue of humanity. And these tablets, he said, told the story of Mua. For years, Churchward studied with the priest, memorizing symbols, learning the cryptic script, slowly piecing together what he claimed was the first history of mankind. And what a history it was! According to Churchward's translations, Mu was a continent in the Pacific Ocean, 5 million square miles of land, home to an advanced civilization called the Narkal, meaning exalted brothers. This culture had mastered agriculture, astronomy, and navigation to a degree that surpassed modern capabilities. They built their cities using anti-gravity technology. They harnessed the Earth's magnetic fields for unlimited energy. They possessed telepathic abilities that made spoken language nearly obsolete. The civilization of Mu was not just technologically advanced, it was spiritually enlightened. A world without war, without poverty, without the divisions of race or nation that plague our modern age. The Narkals worshipped a single creator deity, symbolized by the sun, and their religion emphasized the unity of all life, the interconnection of all things. It was paradise, a golden age when humanity lived in harmony with itself and with nature. Then came the catastrophe. Churchward described it in apocalyptic detail. Massive earthquakes shook the entire continent. Volcanic eruptions followed, not just 1 or 2, but hundreds simultaneously, creating a ring of fire around the Pacific basin. The ground itself began to crack and collapse as gas-filled chambers beneath the continent gave way. And then, in a final devastating moment, the entire landmass sank beneath the waves in a matter of hours. 64 million people gone in a single night. The survivors, Churchward wrote, fled in all directions. They became the founders of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and the great civilizations of Central and South America. This explained the mysterious similarities between these supposedly independent cultures, why pyramids appear in both Egypt and Mexico, why similar flood myths exist around the world, why ancient symbols and religious concepts show such remarkable parallels despite geographical separation. It was a grand, sweeping narrative. It answered so many questions about human prehistory. And when Churchward published his findings in a series of books beginning with The Lost Continent of Mu-2 in 1926, the public response was enormous. The books became international bestsellers. They captured the imagination of millions. Lemuria Mu-2 became one of the great lost continent legends, taking its place alongside Atlantis in the pantheon of civilization's forgotten mysteries. But there was a problem, a fundamental, fatal problem with Churchward's entire story. No one except Churchward ever saw these ancient tablets. He claimed they were returned to the temple in India after he studied them. When scholars asked for evidence, when they requested to examine these extraordinary artifacts, Churchward could produce nothing but his own hand-drawn copies and translations. The entire foundation of the Mu legend rested on the testimony of one man, who provided no verifiable evidence for his extraordinary claims. Modern scholars have thoroughly examined Churchward's work. His translations of ancient symbols were demonstrably incorrect, mixing up characters from different writing systems and different time periods with little regard for actual linguistic evidence. His understanding of geology was decades out of date, even for his own time, relying on now discredited ideas about how continents could suddenly sink. His explanations for cultural similarities between ancient civilizations ignored more prosaic realities: independent invention, cultural diffusion through trade and migration, the universal patterns of human creativity. The verdict is clear. Churchward's Mu never existed. The tablets were likely fabricated. The translations were fantasy. The entire elaborate edifice of Lemurian civilization was a myth. And yet, the legend persists. Despite being dismissed by mainstream science for nearly a century, despite the lack of any physical evidence, despite the geological impossibility of a continent sinking in the way Churchward described, the story of Lemuria refuses to die. Why? Perhaps because it speaks to something deeper than factual accuracy. A human longing for a lost golden age, for a time when we were better than we are now, more unified, more enlightened, living in harmony rather than conflict. The story of Lemuria offers a comforting narrative that humanity was once innocent and wise, that our current troubles are not inevitable features of human nature, but corruptions of an originally pure state. But here's where the story becomes truly interesting, because while Churchward's specific claims about Muir are fantasy, the broader idea of lost lands beneath the Pacific isn't entirely fiction. The Pacific Ocean does hide submerged landmasses, drowned islands, the traces of human settlements swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. The legend of Lemuria, it turns out, may be a mythologized memory of real geological events and real human tragedies. To understand what might actually lie beneath the Pacific, we need to journey back in time, back to the end of the Pleistocene epoch, approximately 20,000 years ago, when Earth was a very different planet. This was the height of the last glacial maximum, the deepest freeze of the most recent ice age. Massive ice sheets, miles thick in places, covered much of North America, Europe and Asia. The world's climate was dramatically colder, rainfall patterns were altered, and most significantly for our story, sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet, the height of a 40-story building. All that water, enough to raise global sea levels by that staggering amount, was locked up in glacial ice, and when you remove that much water from the world's oceans, the map of Earth changes dramatically. Continental shelves that are now submerged became dry land. Islands connected to form larger land masses. Shallow seas became plains and valleys. The world became in effect a much larger place, with vastly more habitable territory. In Southeast Asia, the shallow seas between the mainland and Indonesia drained away, creating a subcontinent called Sunderland that connected present-day Thailand, Malaysia, Borneo, Java, and Sumatra into a single massive landmass, nearly as large as India. In the Pacific, New Guinea and Australia were joined by a land bridge. In the Atlantic, Britain was connected to Europe by Doggerland. These weren't small islands or narrow strips of beach. These were vast territories, hundreds of thousands of square miles of land that supported forests, rivers, lakes, and the humans who lived there. And humans did live there. Archaeological evidence confirms that these now submerged lands were inhabited during the Ice Age. Tools have been found, evidence of settlements. These were prime territories for human habitation, coastal plains with access to both marine and terrestrial resources, riverine environments perfect for early communities. Then, around 15,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. The planet warmed, the glaciers retreated, and all that frozen water began flowing back into the oceans. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe like the legendary sinking of Mu. It was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years. But from the perspective of the people living in coastal areas, it must have seemed like a relentless, inexorable doom. Year by year, generation by generation, the sea crept higher, beaches became shallow lagoons, river valleys flooded into estuaries, the horizon grew closer as the land shrank. Coastal settlements had to be abandoned and rebuilt further inland, only to be abandoned again as the water continued to rise. Imagine being part of a culture living through this transformation. Your great-great-grandparents spoke of coastal plains that stretched to the horizon. You've only known a narrow strip of beach that gets narrower every year. The old hunting grounds are underwater. The sacred sites where your ancestors are buried have been swallowed by the sea. Your entire worldview is shaped by loss, by the slow but undeniable retreat before the advancing ocean. If you're enjoying this journey through one of history's most enduring mysteries, hit that like button. It helps us continue exploring these deep currents of human memory and imagination. Over the course of several thousand years, Sunderland was transformed from a subcontinent into the scattered islands of Indonesia. Millions of square miles of land vanished beneath the waves, entire ecosystems drowned, countless human settlements, Their names, their stories, their achievements disappeared without record. Would your culture not preserve the memory of this catastrophe? Would there not be stories passed down through generations about the lands that once were, the paradise that was lost? And over millennia, as these stories were retold, embellished, merged with other tales, might they not evolve into legends of a vast sunken continent? This is what many researchers now believe happened. The legend of Lemuria isn't a complete fabrication. It's a mythologized memory of real events, the drowning of vast coastal lands at the end of the Ice Age, preserved in oral traditions and eventually codified into more elaborate narratives. The oral traditions of Pacific cultures provide fascinating evidence for this theory. The Polynesian concept of Hawaii Ki, a legendary homeland from which the Polynesian people originated before their great migrations across the Pacific. Different Polynesian cultures have different versions of this story, but common elements include a lost land to the west, often described as being swallowed by the sea or destroyed in a great catastrophe. Is Hawaii Ki a memory of a real place? Some researchers suggest it might preserve cultural memories of migrations from Southeast Asia, possibly including areas of Sunderland that were lost to rising seas. The details are impossible to verify, but the persistence of these traditions across multiple cultures and thousands of miles suggests they're rooted in something more substantial than pure invention. The Maori people of New Zealand speak of Rangiatea, a legendary homeland in central Polynesia from which their ancestors departed. Hawaiian traditions mention Kane Hunamaku, the hidden land of Kane that was submerged beneath the ocean. The Micronesians have stories of a sunken land called Kanamweso. Throughout the Pacific, indigenous cultures preserve traditions of lost islands and drowned lands. Now, it's important not to overstate these connections. These traditions don't prove the existence of Churchwood's continent spanning the entire Pacific. They're too varied, too localized, too specific to different times and places. But they do suggest that Pacific cultures preserved real memories of land lost to rising seas, memories that may date back thousands of years to the end of the Ice Age. And there are other lost lands beyond Sunderland. Consider Doggerland, the territory that once connected Britain to continental Europe. During the Ice Age, the North Sea was dry land, a landscape of gentle hills, marshes and forests, home to herds of mammoths and the Mesolithic hunters who pursued them. Like Sunderland, Doggerland was slowly consumed by rising seas over thousands of years, but its end was far more violent. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a catastrophic tsunami that swept across the last remnants of this land, drowning it in a single devastating event. Imagine experiencing that. You're living in one of the last settlements on Doggerland, watching your world shrink for generations as the sea rises. Then one day, the water suddenly recedes far beyond the normal low tide. Fish flop on exposed seafloor. People walk out to collect them, curious about this strange phenomenon. Then the horizon darkens. An impossibly tall wall of water appears, rushing toward shore, faster than anyone can run. In minutes, everything you know is obliterated. Everyone you love is either dead or a refugee. This is trauma on a civilizational scale. If anyone survives, they will tell stories about this disaster for the rest of their lives. Their children will hear those stories and retell them. Over generations, details will blur, the mechanism will be forgotten or never understood, but the emotional truth will persist, that the sea rose up and destroyed everything. Multiple such disasters across different times and places might eventually merge into a single archetypal story about a great flood, about a drowned homeland, about ancestors who came from a land that no longer exists. Now our search must take us beneath the waves themselves, to the structures and formations on the ocean floor that some believe might be remnants of lost civilizations. These underwater mysteries are at the heart of modern Lemuria theories, tangible evidence that believers point to as proof that advanced ancient cultures did exist and did get swallowed by the sea. Our first destination takes us to the far western edge of the Pacific, to the Ryukyu Islands of Japan. Here in 1986, a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting the waters off the coast of Yamaguni Island. He was looking for hammerhead sharks when he saw something that made him pause, something that seemed to defy the natural geometry of the underwater world. Rising from the seabed, 90 feet below the surface, was a monolith of staggering size and impossible shape. a single immense block of sandstone, nearly 500 feet long and 130 feet wide, appearing to have been carved, shaped, terraced with intelligent intention. This structure, now known as the Yonaguni Monument, has become one of the most polarizing mysteries in modern archaeology. To those who see the hand of humanity in its form, it is nothing less than a sunken city, a remnant of a civilization of unimaginable antiquity. They point to its most striking features with awe: vast flat terraces that end in perfectly vertical drops, shapes that look uncannily like immense staircases ascending the side of the monolith. One area, nicknamed the main terrace, is a broad flat platform that looks for all the world like a ceremonial stage or the foundation of a great temple. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has spent decades studying the site. Convinced that it is artificial, he claims to have identified not only architectural features but also tool marks left in the stone, drainage channels, and even a primitive form of rock art resembling animals and human faces. In his vision, Yonaguni was a coastal city, part of a larger settlement that was submerged by a massive earthquake and tsunami thousands of years ago. Could nature, with its random forces of erosion and tectonic stress, truly carve with such precision? Could it create 90-degree angles and symmetrical patterns on such a monumental scale? To proponents, the answer is no. This must be the work of a lost culture. Yet, for every argument in favor of its artificial origin, there is a sober scientific counterargument. Geologists, most notably Dr. Robert Skosh of Boston University, have studied the monument and reached a very different conclusion. They point out that the entire structure is composed of fine-grained sandstone, a type of rock known for its tendency to fracture along very straight, clean planes. The region is tectonically active, subject to constant earthquakes and immense pressure. Over millennia, this pressure causes the rock to split in grid-like patterns, creating the very right angles and flat surfaces that look so man-made. And so we are left with a profound paradox. 90 feet beneath the waves, a structure that looks designed yet is explained by geology. An arrangement of stone that feels sacred yet is attributed to the blind forces of the planet. Is it simply a trick of the light and the mind, our innate human tendency to see patterns where none exist? Or is it something more, a whisper from a time so distant that we can no longer recognize its handiwork for what it is? The debate continues, and will likely continue for decades more, because underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and limited by technology. We cannot excavate Yonaguni the way we would excavate a site on land. We cannot carefully brush away sediment and document every artifact. The ocean is a hostile environment for detailed investigation, and so the monument keeps its secrets. Natural or artificial, we may never know with certainty. From Yonaguni, our journey takes us halfway around the world, to the Atlantic off the coast of a small island in the Bahamas called Bimini. Because the pattern of submerged stone structures is not confined to one ocean, it is a global phenomenon, and each new discovery adds another layer to the question of what our planet looked like in the deep past. In 1968, divers exploring the shallow, crystal-clear waters off the north shore of Bimini came across an astonishing sight. Lying in just 18 feet of water was what appeared to be a road, a pavement, the foundation of a massive wall, stretching for nearly half a mile in a perfectly straight line before curving gently into a J-shape. This feature, known as the Bimini Road, is composed of hundreds of massive limestone blocks, some as large as 16 feet across. They are fitted together with a precision that seems to defy natural explanation. The discovery caused an immediate sensation, in part because it seemed to fulfill a prophecy by the psychic Edgar Cayce, who had predicted that remnants of Atlantis would be discovered in that very area in 1968 or 1969. For decades, the Bimini Road became a focal point for those searching for lost civilizations. But just as with Yonaguni, the scientific community offered a detailed natural explanation. The stones are beach rock, a type of sedimentary rock that forms naturally in the intertidal zone where waves break. In this zone, sand, shells, and debris become cemented together by calcium carbonate that precipitates from seawater. This process creates hard, flat pavements that often fracture into regular rectangular blocks. Geologists have documented similar beach rock formations in other locations. They are clearly natural, and yet, the Bimini Road looks so deliberately constructed, so purposefully arranged. It's another Rorschach test. We see in it what we want or expect to see. A romantic sees the ruins of Atlantis. A skeptical geologist sees natural rock formation. The truth may lie somewhere in between, perhaps a natural formation that was enhanced or modified by human hands in antiquity. What all these underwater mysteries share is ambiguity. They exist in that uncertain space between natural and artificial, that liminal zone where geology and archaeology blur together. And perhaps that's fitting, because the legend of Lemuria itself exists in that same uncertain space between myth and memory, between fantasy and forgotten fact. The Pacific Ocean keeps its secrets, and maybe, just maybe, some of those secrets are worth keeping. Some mysteries are more valuable unsolved than solved, because in the not knowing, in the questioning and wondering, we reveal something important about ourselves, our need for mystery, our hunger for connection to something greater than ourselves, our desire to believe that there are still wonders waiting to be discovered just beyond the edge of our knowledge. But now we must ask the harder question, the geological question. Could a continent actually sink the way Churchward described? Could millions of square miles of land suddenly plunge beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic night? The answer, according to everything we know about plate tectonics, is no. Continents don't sink. They can't sink. Not in the way the legend describes. Here's why. Continental crust and oceanic crust are fundamentally different. Continental crust is thicker, lighter, composed primarily of granitic rocks rich in silicon and aluminium. Oceanic crust is thinner, denser, composed of basaltic rocks rich in iron and magnesium. Continental crust floats higher on the underlying mantle, which is why continents stand above sea level. Oceanic crust sits lower, which is why ocean basins hold water. You cannot sink a continent into an ocean basin. The physics doesn't work. Continental crust being lighter will always float higher than oceanic crust. There is no mechanism by which a 5 million square mile continent could suddenly plunge beneath the waves without leaving obvious traces. If Lemuria had existed and sunk as Churchward described, we would see its remains on the ocean floor, submerged continental shelf, thick sedimentary layers, granitic rather than basaltic rock. None of this exists in the Pacific where Churchward placed Muss. The ocean floor there is clearly oceanic crust, basaltic rock formed at mid-ocean ridges and spreading outward, not continental crust that somehow sank. The Pacific does have submerged continental fragments. Zealandia, a massive piece of continental crust roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent, lies mostly underwater east of Australia. It's a genuine lost continent in the geological sense, but it didn't sink catastrophically. It subsided gradually over millions of years through tectonic processes, and it submerged long before humans evolved, so it can't be the Lemuria of legend. What about earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? The Pacific Ring of Fire is the most geologically active region on Earth. Could a massive seismic event have destroyed Lemuria, even if it couldn't sink it? The Pacific Ring of Fire is real. This 40,000-kilometer horseshoe of tectonic plate boundaries encircles the basin and accounts for 90% of the world's earthquakes and 75% of its active volcanoes. It's where the Earth's internal fires burn closest to the surface, where the planet's restless crust grinds and collides and tears itself apart. Earthquakes along the Ring of Fire can be devastating. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, magnitude 9.1, triggered a tsunami that killed nearly 20,000 people. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile, magnitude 9.5, the most powerful ever recorded, caused destruction across the Pacific Basin. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, magnitude 9.1, generated a tsunami that killed over 200,000 people across multiple countries. These are catastrophic events, civilization ending for anyone caught in their direct path. And they do leave scars in oral tradition. Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest preserve stories of a great earthquake and tsunami that matches geological evidence from around 1700 CE. Japanese historical records document devastating tsunamis going back over 1,000 years. So could a megaquake along the Ring of Fire have destroyed a Pacific civilization? Could it be the basis for the Lemuria legend? Possibly. Not by sinking a continent, but by devastating coastal settlements, by triggering tsunamis that wiped out cities, by causing volcanic eruptions that buried entire regions in ash, A massive earthquake, perhaps combined with volcanic eruptions and tsunamis, could certainly have destroyed a maritime culture that depended on coastal resources and ocean navigation. And here's where the legend might contain a kernel of truth. Not about a sunken continent, but about a catastrophe that disrupted Pacific cultures, that forced migrations, that created refugees who carried traumatic memories to new lands. Those memories, over thousands of years, could have been mythologized into stories of a drowned homeland, of a paradise lost, of ancestors who came from a land that no longer exists. The Pacific has also experienced volcanic catastrophes that dwarf anything in recent history. Consider the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. It ejected 160 cubic kilometers of material, killed over 70,000 people directly, and tens of thousands more died from the subsequent famine and disease. The eruption was heard over 1,600 miles away. The ash cloud circled the globe. It caused the year without a summer in 1816, crop failures, famine across the northern hemisphere, snow in June in New England, failed harvests across Europe. It was an apocalypse, and it came from a single volcano. Now imagine a similar or even larger eruption occurring in prehistoric times, entire islands depopulated, ash falls making regions uninhabitable for years, the darkness and cold persisting for months. To survivors, this would seem like the end of the world, the gods destroying creation, the sun dying, the earth itself rejecting life. Such an event might well be remembered as the destruction of a homeland, the moment when paradise was lost. The Lake Toba eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, was even more catastrophic, a super-eruption that may have caused a volcanic winter lasting years, potentially creating a population bottleneck in human evolution. Genetic evidence suggests that human population might have crashed to as few as 10,000 individuals at this time. If our species nearly went extinct due to this catastrophe, if some cultural memory of it persisted, however distorted, it might form the deepest, darkest layer of our collective nightmare about lands destroyed and civilizations lost. But volcanic eruptions and tsunamis aren't the only catastrophes that could have fed the Lemuria legend. There are stranger, more mysterious events in Earth's recent past. Events that science is only now beginning to understand. Events that might explain some of the more apocalyptic elements of the myth. Around 12,900 years ago, right at the boundary between the Ice Age and our current epoch, something happened. The warming trend that had been melting glaciers for thousands of years suddenly stopped, reversed. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged back to near glacial conditions, not gradually, but in a geological heartbeat. This event is called the Younger Dryas, and for decades scientists struggled to explain it. What could cause such a dramatic, sudden climate reversal? What force was powerful enough to interrupt the end of an ice age? One controversial theory proposes that around 12,900 years ago, Earth passed through the debris stream of a large disintegrating comet. A swarm of fragments, some miles wide, slammed into our planet. The largest pieces struck the North American ice sheet. The resulting cataclysm would have been biblical in scale, the initial impacts releasing more energy than all the nuclear weapons on Earth combined, instantly vaporizing millions of tons of ice and rock, unleashing the first and most immediate agent of destruction, the flood. Imagine standing on the coast of North America as a comet fragment hits the ice sheet, hundreds of miles inland. You don't see the impact. You see the sky light up brighter than day, feel the ground shake, hear a sound like the world splitting apart. Then, silence. For a few minutes, nothing. Then you notice something strange. The ocean is receding, pulling back from the shore faster than any tide, the water draining away as if someone pulled a plug, fish flopping on exposed seafloor, boats stranded in mud. And then you see it, a wall of water on the horizon, taller than mountains, moving faster than anything you've ever seen, a mega tsunami generated by billions of tons of meltwater suddenly released from the ice sheet, racing across the landscape at hundreds of miles per hour. There is no escape, no high ground high enough. The wave sweeps over everything, scours the land down to bedrock, carries away forests, animals, entire ecosystems, and when it finally recedes, nothing remains but devastation. This is one scenario for how a Pacific civilization could have been destroyed, not by a sinking continent, but by a cosmic catastrophe, by forces from beyond Earth that our ancestors couldn't understand or predict. The memory of such an event, preserved in oral tradition, might well transform into legends about the gods destroying a wicked civilization, about paradise being lost, about the world being cleansed by flood and fire. The evidence for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is contested. Not all scientists accept it, but the correlation is striking. The timing matches, the geographical distribution of impact markers, tiny diamonds formed under extreme pressure, layers of carbon suggesting massive wildfires. These appear precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary in sediments across North America and Europe. And there's another correlation. The Younger Dryas marks the extinction of North American megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. These animals survived hundreds of thousands of years of climate fluctuations, but at the Younger Dryas boundary, they disappear. It also marks the disappearance of the Clovis culture, the most widespread hunter-gatherer culture in Ice Age North America. Clovis points, their distinctive spear tips, are found across the continent before the Younger Dryas. After, they vanish, replaced by different tool types, different cultures. Something happened 12,900 years ago. Something that disrupted climate, caused extinctions, forced human populations to adapt or perish. Whether it was a comet impact or some other mechanism, the effects were real. The catastrophe was real, and the survivors, they would have told stories. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. The Younger Dryas ended 11,700 years ago. Also suddenly, also dramatically. The climate didn't warm gradually, it snapped back to warmth in a matter of decades. The ice sheets, already weakened, collapsed rapidly. Sea levels rose, coastlines transformed. This is exactly the time period that many lost continent legends place their catastrophes. Atlantis, in Plato's account, was destroyed 9,000 years before his time, which would be around 11,400 years ago, close to the end of the Younger Dryas. Churchward placed the destruction of Mu around 12,000 years ago, again right at the Younger Dryas boundary. Is this coincidence, or is there a real climatic event or series of events at this critical juncture that became mythologized into legends of drowned continents and lost civilizations? The rising seas at the end of the Younger Dryas were real. The flooding of coastal lands was real. The displacement of populations was real. And it happened rapidly enough, over just a few centuries, that individual lifetimes would have witnessed dramatic changes. Your grandparents' coastline would have been miles further out than yours. The islands they remembered would be submerged by the time you had grandchildren of your own. This is intergenerational trauma. This is the kind of experience that burns itself into cultural memory, that gets passed down in stories, that transforms over time into myth and legend. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples around the Pacific preserve remarkable details about geological events. The Klamath people of the Pacific Northwest have a legend about two mountains, Mount Mazama and Mount Shasta, fighting each other by hurling fire and rock. The legend describes the collapse of Mount Mazama's summit, creating Crater Lake. Geologists have confirmed this event happened about 7,700 years ago. The oral tradition preserved accurate geological information for nearly 8,000 years. 8,000 years of storytelling, grandparents to grandchildren, generation after generation, kept the memory alive. If the Klamath could preserve the story of a volcanic eruption for 8,000 years, what other catastrophes might be preserved in oral traditions around the Pacific? What memories of drowned lands, of great floods, of islands that disappeared? What truth might lie within these stories? The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have oral traditions that describe coastlines and landscapes that only existed during the Ice Age. They speak of lands that are now underwater, of walking to places that are now islands. Some of these traditions may be over 10,000 years old, making them the oldest continuously maintained oral histories in the world. The Gunditj Mara people of southeastern Australia have stories about volcanic eruptions in their territory, the eruptions of the Budjbim volcano. Scientists initially dated these eruptions to about 5,000 years ago, but the oral traditions suggested they were much more recent. Further investigation revealed that some eruptions occurred less than 2,000 years ago, exactly as the stories indicated. Oral tradition was right. Scientific dating was wrong. The stories preserved truth that written records and modern science had missed. So when Pacific cultures speak of Hawaii, of Kane Hunamoku, of ancestral lands that sank beneath the sea, should we dismiss these as pure fantasy? Or should we listen carefully for the kernels of truth they might contain? The challenge is separating historical memory from mythological embellishment. Stories change in the telling. Details get added, removed, transformed. Over thousands of years, a story about a specific island being swallowed by a tsunami might evolve into a story about an entire continent sinking in a single night. The emotional truth remains: loss, catastrophe, displacement, but the details become exaggerated, dramatized, mythologized. This is how legend is born from history. Not through deliberate fabrication, but through the natural evolution of storytelling across generations, each retelling slightly different, each storyteller adding their own interpretation. Over millennia, the original event becomes unrecognizable, but its essence persists. Lemuria may be this kind of legend, not a complete invention, but a composite, built from many different real events. Sunderland drowning over thousands of years, Doggerland destroyed by tsunami, volcanic eruptions in the Pacific, earthquake-generating catastrophes around the Ring of Fire, comet impacts or climate reversals at the end of the Ice Age. All of these real catastrophes, experienced by real people, remembered in real oral traditions, eventually flowing together into a single archetypal story. The story of the lost homeland, the drowned paradise, the motherland beneath the sea. This interpretation honors both science and mythology. It respects geological evidence while also respecting the power and persistence of oral tradition. It suggests that Lemuria is false in its literal details, but true in its emotional and psychological core. Every human culture has flood myths. Every civilization tells stories about great disasters that destroyed previous worlds. The biblical flood, the Greek flood of Deucalion, the Mesopotamian flood of Gilgamesh, Hindu stories of Manu surviving a great deluge, Chinese legends of the Great Flood, indigenous American traditions about world-cleansing waters. Are all these stories independent inventions, coincidence, or do they preserve a collective human memory of real catastrophes, of the flooding at the end of the Ice Age, of tsunamis and hurricanes and river floods that devastated ancient communities? The latter seems more likely. Humans preserve memories of trauma. We tell stories about disasters. We create narratives to make sense of suffering and loss. And over millennia, as cultures interact and stories merge, these individual memories can coalesce into universal archetypes. The flood story becomes the flood story. The drowned land becomes the drowned land. The lost civilization becomes the lost civilization. Lemuria, Atlantis, Mu. These aren't specific historical places, they're composite memories, containers for the accumulated trauma and longing of countless ancestors who experienced real catastrophes and real loss. This doesn't make the legends less important. In some ways, it makes them more important, because they're not just stories about the past, they're stories about the human condition, about our relationship with nature, about our vulnerability to forces beyond our control, about loss and memory, and the persistence of meaning in the face of impermanence. And they're stories about the future as well, because we are living through our own version of rising seas, our own slow-motion catastrophe. Climate change is raising ocean levels, coastal cities are flooding with increasing frequency, small island nations in the Pacific, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, face an existential threat. These islands will become uninhabitable within our lifetimes. The people of these nations are watching their homes disappear, watching the ocean claim land that's been inhabited for thousands of years, watching their children grow up knowing they'll have to leave to become refugees from a changing climate. Where will they go? Australia? New Zealand? The United States? And when they arrive in these new lands, what stories will they tell their grandchildren? Stories about islands that used to exist, about lands that were swallowed by the sea, about ancestors who came from a place that no longer appears on maps. These future stories will become the new chapters of the Lemuria legend. They'll merge with older traditions about Hawaii and Kane Hunamaku. They'll blend with scientific understanding of climate change and sea level rise. And over generations, over centuries, they'll transform into new myths, New legends, new ways of making meaning from catastrophe. This is happening now, not in some distant past but in our present moment. We are witnessing the creation of new flood myths, new legends of drowned lands. Future generations will tell stories about our time, about the Great Warming, about the rising seas, about the islands that disappeared, about the climate refugees who carried their cultures to new lands. Will those future people understand that these were real historical events? Or will the stories become mythologized, dramatized, transformed into legends that blur fact and fantasy? Will our descendants 10,000 years from now debate whether Tuvalu really existed, whether the stories of drowned Pacific islands are historical memories or pure mythology? This is the power and the tragedy of oral tradition. It preserves truth but transforms it in the preservation. It keeps memory alive but changes the memory in the keeping. And over long enough timescales, over thousands of years, the original events become unrecognizable except to those who know where to look and how to listen. So, Lemuria is a warning, not about the past but about the future. It shows us what happens to memories of catastrophe over deep time, how real events become legendary, how historical trauma becomes mythological narrative, and it reminds us that future generations will tell stories about us, about our time, our choices, our catastrophes, and those stories will be both true and false. True in their emotional and psychological core, false in many of their specific details. This is why the legend matters, not because it's historically accurate, but because it's psychologically and spiritually accurate. It captures something essential about human experience, about loss and memory, about the need to make meaning from catastrophe, about the persistence of trauma across generations, about the power of story to preserve what would otherwise be forgotten. And it reminds us of our own impermanence, that the world we know will not last forever, that coastlines change, that islands disappear, that civilizations rise and fall, that everything we build, everything we create, everything we are, all of it is temporary, subject to forces larger than ourselves, vulnerable to changes we can't control. But it also reminds us of something more hopeful, that humans survive, that we adapt, that we carry our stories forward, even when we lose everything else, that memory persists even when monuments crumble, that culture continues even when the land it grew on disappears beneath the waves. The survivors of Sunderland didn't vanish when their land drowned. They moved, they adapted, they carried their knowledge and their stories to new places. They became the ancestors of cultures that still exist today. Their genes, their languages, their traditions, all survived the catastrophe. Transformed, yes. Changed, absolutely. But not erased, not lost, not forgotten. This is the real lesson of Lemuria. Not that a specific continent sank, but that humanity is resilient, that we survive catastrophes, that we preserve what matters across generations, that we tell stories to make sense of our world, and that those stories, however mythologized they become, contain truths worth remembering. Consider subscribing to Simply About Earth if you haven't already, where curiosity finds its quiet corner and wonder takes its time. We explore mysteries like this that connect us to our planet's deep history and to each other. The peopling of the Pacific is one of the great achievements in human history. Polynesian navigators, setting out from Southeast Asia around 3,000 years ago, eventually settled virtually every habitable island in the Pacific Ocean, from Hawaii to Easter Island, from New Zealand to the far-flung atolls of Micronesia. This required extraordinary skill in navigation, boat building, and survival at sea. They navigated by stars, by wave patterns, by bird migrations, by subtle cues invisible to untrained eyes. They carried with them plants, animals, technologies, and cultural knowledge that allowed them to establish viable communities on tiny isolated islands thousands of miles from the nearest continent. How did they develop these remarkable seafaring abilities? The traditional answer is that they evolved gradually as populations island hopped through the Western Pacific, but some researchers suggest a more provocative hypothesis, that these seafaring traditions might trace back much further, to coastal peoples displaced by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, people forced to become ever more dependent on marine resources, ever more skilled at navigating coastal waters, until eventually they were confident enough to strike out across open ocean in search of new lands. This would make Polynesian navigation not a recent invention but a very ancient one, a skill set refined over thousands of years in response to a changing world. And it would mean that the legend of Lemuria contains this kernel of truth, not a lost continent in the Pacific, but lost coastal lands around the Pacific Rim, and the maritime traditions that developed in response to their loss. Easter Island deserves special attention in our story. This tiny volcanic speck, 63 square miles of land in the vast empty southeastern Pacific, is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. The nearest inhabited land is Pitcairn Island, over 1,000 miles away. The coast of South America is more than 2,000 miles to the east. It is, by any measure, extraordinarily remote. Yet, around 1200 CE, Polynesian voyagers reached this island, established a thriving culture, and created one of the most mysterious archaeological sites on Earth. The moai, those massive stone heads that gaze inland from platforms around the coast. Nearly 900 moai were carved, some weighing as much as 80 tons, using only stone tools. For believers in Lemuria, Easter Island holds special significance. If a great Pacific civilization once existed, Easter Island might be the last remaining peak of that drowned continent, the highest point that remained above water when the rest sank. The moai might be remnants or echoes of a much older culture. This romantic notion has been thoroughly investigated and rejected by archaeology. The moai are definitively Polynesian in style and technique, clearly related to other stone carving traditions in Polynesia. Radiocarbon dating firmly places their creation after the island's settlement around 1200 CE. There's no evidence of any earlier culture or of any connection to a hypothetical sunken continent. But Easter Island does illustrate something profound about the human spirit, our ability to create monumental works in the most unlikely places, our drive to establish culture and meaning even in isolation, our capacity to survive and thrive in environments that seem impossibly remote and challenging. The real story of Easter Island is more impressive than any legend about Lemuria. It's about what actual humans actually accomplished, which is far more inspiring than imaginary superhuman civilizations. The island also serves as a cautionary tale. Easter Island's civilization eventually collapsed, likely due to environmental degradation. The island was once forested, but the trees were cut down, possibly to move the moai, leading to soil erosion and resource depletion. This ecological catastrophe mirrors the legendary catastrophe of Lemuria in an important way. The difference is this: the Easter Islanders were undone not by cosmic forces but by their own unsustainable exploitation of their environment. The legend of a continent destroyed by natural forces is comforting in a way. It absolves us of responsibility. The reality of cultures destroyed by their own environmental mismanagement is more uncomfortable, but more relevant to our current situation. Because we are living through our own version of rising seas, our own slow-motion catastrophe. Climate change is raising ocean levels. Coastal cities are flooding with increasing frequency. Small island nations in the Pacific, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, face an existential threat. These islands will become uninhabitable within our lifetimes. Where will these people go when their islands disappear? They'll become climate refugees, displaced not by war or persecution, but by the changing environment. Their cultures, intimately tied to specific places, will need to adapt or risk being lost. Their languages may die out if communities are dispersed. This is a slow-motion version of the Lemuria catastrophe, not happening in a single night, but unfolding over decades, giving people time to watch their world disappear. These contemporary Pacific Islanders are creating their own oral traditions about land lost to rising seas. Future generations of their descendants may tell stories about ancestral islands that were swallowed by the ocean. These stories might eventually merge with older traditions about Hawaii and other legendary homelands. The Lemuria narrative may be enriched with new chapters, written not in ancient times but in our own era. This makes the legend unexpectedly relevant. It's not just about the past, it's about the future. About what happens to peoples and cultures when the places they've called home become uninhabitable. About memory and loss and adaptation. About the human capacity to survive displacement while preserving cultural identity. So what does Lemuria mean? If the literal continent didn't exist, if Churchward's story was fabricated, if the geological evidence contradicts the legend, why does it matter? Because Lemuria exists, not as a physical continent beneath the Pacific, but as a continent of memory, a symbolic motherland built from real sorrows and real triumphs, from real drowned lands, Sunderland, Doggerland, the countless coastal territories claimed by rising seas, from real catastrophes, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions that devastated Pacific cultures, from real human experiences, displacement, trauma, loss, the struggle to preserve identity in the face of overwhelming change. The legend endures because it captures emotional truths that are more powerful than geological facts. We have a deep need to believe in golden ages, in times when things were better, more harmonious, more wise. The story of Lemuria offers this comfort, that humanity was once innocent, that our current troubles are not inevitable, that we can reclaim something of what was lost. We also have a deep need for origin stories, for narratives that explain where we came from and why we are the way we are. Churchward's claim that all civilizations descended from Lemuria was wrong in its specifics but captures a deeper truth. We are all connected. We all descended from a relatively small population in Africa. From there we spread across the globe carrying our genes, our technologies, our stories. The similarities between ancient cultures aren't evidence of a single lost civilization. They're evidence of our common humanity, our shared cognitive capabilities, our similar responses to similar challenges, our universal human nature expressing itself in parallel ways across different times and places. When we look at pyramids in Egypt and Mexico, we're not seeing evidence of Lemurian colonists. We're seeing evidence that humans everywhere, given stone and labor, tend to build impressive monumental structures, that pyramids are a logical, stable form for very large buildings. When we find flood myths in cultures around the world, we're not discovering memories of Mu. We're recognizing that floods are universal human experiences, that every culture has experienced and remembered such catastrophes. The real story of human prehistory is more complex, more interesting, and more inspiring than the legend of Lemuria. It's a story of multiple migrations, cultural exchanges, independent inventions, adaptations to diverse environments, the gradual accumulation of knowledge across thousands of generations. It's a story of resilience in the face of real catastrophes, ice ages, droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, all overcome by human ingenuity and cooperation. And the Pacific Ocean, that vast blue expanse that supposedly hides Lemuria, is itself an extraordinary character in the human story. It's the ocean our ancestors crossed in the greatest feat of navigation in human history, the Polynesian expansion that settled thousands of islands across millions of square miles using only the stars, the waves, and accumulated traditional knowledge. The Pacific is not a barrier, but a highway, a connector rather than a divider for people skilled enough to navigate it. The waves that break on remote shores have carried explorers, traders, migrants, refugees. They've connected cultures separated by vast distances. They've facilitated the exchange of ideas, genes, technologies across an ocean that covers a third of the planet. The Pacific is also a reminder of how much of Earth's surface remains unexplored and mysterious. We've mapped the ocean floor with sonar, but much of it has never been directly observed by human eyes. We've sent submersibles to some of the deepest trenches, but vast areas remain unvisited. There could be surprises waiting. Not Churchward's continent, but perhaps smaller submerged islands, underwater caves that were occupied during the Ice Age, ancient shipwrecks from voyages we have no historical record of, geological features we haven't yet discovered. The quest for Lemuria, even if the literal continent is fiction, has value. It drives underwater exploration, encourages research into ancient coastlines and sea level changes, motivates the preservation of indigenous traditions and knowledge, reminds us to remain open to the possibility that conventional history is incomplete. The problem comes when we abandon critical thinking entirely, when we accept extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence, when we let our desire for mystery override our commitment to truth. The balance is to maintain a sense of wonder, while also maintaining intellectual rigor. Yes, conventional wisdom can be wrong. Göbekli Tepe proved that. Yes, there are probably significant discoveries still to be made about human prehistory. The next one might come tomorrow. Yes, indigenous traditions and oral histories deserve respect and serious consideration. They often contain important information overlooked by Western scholarship. But we also need to insist on evidence, on logical reasoning, on the scientific method that has proven so effective at helping us understand the world accurately. Lemuria, at its best, represents the human capacity for imagination and our deep hunger for meaning and connection. At its worst, it represents gullibility and the rejection of evidence in favor of comforting fantasies. The challenge is to appreciate the legend for what it genuinely tells us about ourselves, while not mistaking it for literal history. As night deepens, as the Pacific waves continue their eternal rhythm, as the stars that guided Polynesian navigators continue their slow wheel across the heavens, we can appreciate the legend of Lemuria for what it truly is. Not a historical fact, but a cultural creation, a tapestry woven from real threads of memory about drowned lands, from human longing for golden ages, from our universal need for stories that make sense of loss and catastrophe, from our desire to believe that we're connected to something greater and older than ourselves. The ocean floor does hide mysteries, but they're not the mysteries Churchward described. They're the mysteries of real human settlements from the Ice Age, waiting to be discovered by advancing technology. They're the mysteries of how exactly our ancestors navigated this vast ocean with such skill. They're the geological mysteries of how plate tectonics shaped the Pacific Basin over millions of years. These real mysteries are, in their way, more exciting than any fictional lost continent, because they're actually solvable. We can genuinely discover them through patient research, careful excavation, rigorous analysis, and in discovering them, we discover something about ourselves, about human adaptability, about our species' remarkable ability to survive and thrive in changing environments, about the power of oral tradition to preserve important information across countless generations. We learn humility about how much we don't know and can't know about deep time and ancient peoples. We learn creativity about how different cultures explain their world and their past. We learn appreciation for the real achievements of our ancestors, achievements that are often more impressive than any legend. The waters of the Pacific are deep, deeper than Mount Everest is tall in some places, down there in that cold darkness, under pressures that would crush a human instantly, in a realm of strange bioluminescent creatures and alien landscapes. What secrets remain? Not Lemuria, but secrets nonetheless. The bones of ancient mariners in their canoes, the artifacts dropped from boats thousands of years ago, the traces of settlements on what were once islands but are now seamounts, the geological record of ancient catastrophes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes that shook the Pacific Rim and left their mark in stone and sediment. Let yourself drift now. Drift like an ocean current carrying debris from some long-forgotten shore. Let the questions fade, the debates about what's real and what's legend, about what's evidence and what's fantasy. Let it all dissolve into the gentle rhythm of waves, the slow breath of tides, the patient turning of earth beneath ancient starlight. Somewhere in the Pacific tonight, waves are breaking on a beach, foam hissing on volcanic sand, the eternal conversation between sea and shore. Those waves have been breaking for millions of years, long before any humans were there to see them, and they'll continue long after we're gone. They're indifferent to our legends, to our need for meaning, to our hunger for lost golden ages. They simply are. Water meeting land, energy dissipating, the great cycles of evaporation and precipitation playing out on a planetary scale. And yet those same waves carry within them, in a sense, the memory of everything they've ever touched. The water molecules in tonight's breakers might have lapped against the shores of Sunderland 12,000 years ago. They might have supported Polynesian voyagers on their journey to Easter Island. They might have witnessed the formation of islands and their erosion back into the sea. Water cycles through the ocean, the atmosphere, the land. And in that cycling, in that endless movement, there's a kind of memory, a kind of continuity that connects all times and all places. Close your eyes. Imagine you're floating on the Pacific surface on a perfect calm night. The stars above are reflected in the water below. You seem suspended in a universe of light. The water is warm, supportive, gently lifting and lowering you with its slow breathing. You could be anywhere. You could be any time. Past and present and future all exist simultaneously in this moment of perfect stillness. Beneath you, so far beneath that you can't even imagine it, the ocean floor. sediments slowly accumulating, layer upon layer, recording in rock and mud the history of millions of years. Volcanic ridges where new seafloor is being created, spreading outward at the rate your fingernails grow. Subduction zones where old seafloor is being pulled back down into the mantle to be recycled into molten rock. The slow dance of continents, the patient work of geology, the deep time that makes human history seem like a single breath. Is there a lost continent down there? No, not in the way Churchwood imagined. But there are lost things, lost islands, lost coastlines, lost settlements from a time when the sea was lower and the world was shaped differently. There are fossils of creatures that swam in these waters millions of years before humans evolved. There are mineral deposits and geological formations that tell stories about Earth's deep past. There are mysteries still unsolved, discoveries still waiting to be made. You're sinking now, gently, peacefully, down through layers of water that grow darker and colder, down past the zone where sunlight penetrates into the permanent midnight of the deep ocean. Strange creatures drift by, bioluminescent, ghostly. The pressure increases, the temperature drops toward freezing, but you're safe, protected, still descending into the unknown. At this depth you might find a seamount, the submerged peak of an extinct volcano, its summit hundreds of feet below the surface, but still rising from the abyssal plain. Currents swirl around it, bringing nutrients that support gardens of coral, forests of sponges, schools of fish that glow in the darkness. This could have been an island once, thousands of years ago when sea levels were lower. People might have lived here, fished in these waters, told stories beneath these stars that are now invisible under hundreds of feet of ocean. The seafloor itself, when you finally reach it, not flat but mountainous, dramatic, more extreme in its topography than the surface world above, ridges and trenches, volcanic cones and vast plains of sediment, hydrothermal vents spewing superheated water, and supporting entire ecosystems based not on sunlight but on chemical energy from Earth's interior. This is an alien world, yet it's part of our world, connected by water, by the great cycles that govern our living planet. Lying here on the ocean floor, in your imagination, in this meditation between waking and sleep, you feel the weight of water above you, the weight of time, the weight of all the centuries of human wondering about what lies beneath the waves. Lemuria doesn't exist here, but something else does. The reality of Earth's dynamic history, the evidence of how our planet changes and transforms, the truth that seas rise and fall, that land emerges and submerges, that nothing is permanent except change itself. And in that impermanence there's something profound. We build our cities on coasts, knowing they're vulnerable. We create our civilizations in the spaces between catastrophes. We tell our stories knowing they'll be forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. But we build and create and tell them anyway, because that's what humans do. We make meaning in a universe that doesn't inherently have meaning. We create order in the midst of entropy. We establish connections in the face of isolation. The legend of Lemuria is one such creation, a meaning-making story, an attempt to explain puzzles and patterns, to connect ourselves to a grander narrative, to cope with loss and change. It's not literally true, but it's true in the way that myths are true. It expresses real human experiences and emotions through symbolic narrative. The drowned homeland isn't the Pacific continent of Mu, but it is Sunderland and Doggerland and all the other lands claimed by rising seas. The ancient wisdom isn't telepathy and anti-gravity, but it is the navigation skills of Polynesian voyagers and the oral traditions that preserved knowledge across countless generations. Rising now, slowly, gently, back toward the surface and the light, the pressure eases, the water warms, strange deep-sea creatures give way to familiar fish, the darkness lightens to blue, to azure, to the shimmer of sunlight dancing on waves. You break the surface and breathe the sweet air, stars above and dark water below, suspended between depths and heights. The Pacific stretches around you to every horizon, the largest ocean on Earth, covering more than a third of the planet's surface. It contains more water than all the other oceans combined. It has more islands than all the other oceans combined. It was the last ocean to be explored by Europeans, and in many ways it remains the most mysterious, the least known, the most capable of surprising us with new discoveries. This is the ocean that doesn't hide Lemuria, but does hide countless stories we've yet to fully tell. Stories of human courage and navigation skill. Stories of geological transformation and evolutionary adaptation. Stories of connection across vast distances. Stories of survival and loss, of catastrophe and resilience, of the eternal relationship between humans and the sea that birthed all life on Earth. The waves rock you gently, back and forth, like a mother rocking a child. The motion is hypnotic, soothing, ancient. This is the rhythm that governed life in the oceans for billions of years before life emerged onto land. This is the rhythm that pulled our aquatic ancestors toward shores, that taught them to survive in tidal zones, that eventually led to their descendants, us, exploring and naming and creating stories about the ocean that made us possible. Let go of questions now. Let go of the need to know what's true and what's legend. Let go of certainty and doubt alike. Just float here, under these stars, on this ancient water, part of the great web of life and time that connects all things. You're a mammal who evolved from fish, carrying ocean water in your blood, sharing genes with corals and jellyfish and every living thing. You're star stuff, as Carl Sagan said. Atoms forged in ancient supernovas, organized into the temporary pattern that's you. You're a storytelling ape on a water-covered rock, orbiting a medium-sized star in an ordinary spiral galaxy. You're also in this moment of peaceful floating under perfect stars, eternal, connected to everything that has ever lived and everything that ever will live. The same water that makes up most of your body makes up most of the ocean. The same carbon atoms in your cells have been part of plants, animals, rocks, other humans throughout Earth's history. You're not separate from the ocean or the Earth or the cosmos. You're a temporary arrangement of their fundamental components, experiencing existence from a particular perspective, creating meaning through consciousness. The legend of Lemuria asks, where did we come from? Where is our true home? What have we lost? These are the right questions, even if the specific answer, a sunken Pacific continent, is wrong. We came from Africa, from small populations of early humans who spread across the globe. Our true home is Earth itself, this beautiful water planet with its dynamic geology and flourishing life. What we've lost is not a golden age of perfection, but the countless ordinary lives of our ancestors, their knowledge and experiences and perspectives that vanished when they died, unless they were passed on through stories, art, artifacts, genes. But we've also gained so much. The accumulated knowledge of thousands of generations, technologies that let us explore the ocean depths, map the seafloor, understand plate tectonics and genetic evolution, and the deep history of our planet, the ability to preserve knowledge in writing, in recordings, in digital form, no longer dependent solely on fragile oral traditions. Connections across vast distances. You can read these words from anywhere on Earth, can share ideas with people you'll never meet, can access information that would have seemed magical to our ancestors. The future stretches before us like the Pacific, vast, full of unknown possibilities, with storms and calms ahead, with islands of safety and depths of danger. We don't know what we'll discover. We don't know what challenges we'll face, but we carry forward the resilience and ingenuity that allowed our ancestors to survive ice ages and droughts, to cross oceans and colonize remote islands, to adapt to every environment Earth offers. We have that same creativity, that same courage, that same capacity for wonder that made us human. Sleep now. Let the gentle waves rock you into dreams. Dream of ancient voyagers navigating by stars. Dream of islands emerging from and returning to the sea. Dream of the eternal dance of water and rock and life. Dream of connections spanning oceans and centuries. Dream of the mysteries still unsolved and the discoveries still waiting. Dream of Lemuria, not as a lost continent, but as a continent of mind. The imaginative space where possibility and memory merge, where science and story enrich each other, where we honor both truth and wonder. The Pacific keeps its secrets, and that's as it should be. Some mysteries shouldn't be completely solved. Some questions should remain open. Some spaces should stay unexplored, reserved for future generations to discover, for future technologies to reveal, for the endless human project of learning about our world and ourselves. We know so much more than our ancestors did, and we know that we know almost nothing about this vast, complex, beautiful universe we inhabit. Rest in that paradox. Rest in the comfort of knowing and the excitement of not knowing. Rest in the reality of what science has discovered and the possibility of what we might yet learn. Rest in the solid ground of evidence and the fertile soil of imagination. Rest in the fact that while Lemuria may not be real, the human experiences and longings it represents are absolutely real and absolutely valid and absolutely worth honoring. The waves continue their eternal rhythm. The stars continue their slow wheel. The ocean continues its patient work of shaping coastlines and supporting life. And you continue your journey through this remarkable existence, carrying within you the memories of your ancestors and the possibilities of your descendants, connected to everything, part of everything, temporary and eternal all at once. The story of Lemuria is ultimately the story of us, our capacity to dream, our need to remember, our determination to find meaning in a world that sometimes seems meaningless, our refusal to accept that everything we are and everything we've been can simply disappear without trace. And in that refusal, in that stubborn insistence that the past matters and memory persists and lost things can be found again, there is something beautiful, something profoundly human, something worth celebrating, even if the specific legend isn't historically accurate. Because the truth is this: Lemuria exists wherever we need it to exist, in our imaginations, in our dreams, in our collective longing for a world that was once better and might someday be better again. It's a continent not of stone and soil, but of hope and memory, of what we've lost and what we might still find, of who we were and who we might yet become. The ocean has given us so much. Life itself emerged from those primordial seas. Every cell in your body carries the chemical signature of that ancient origin. The rhythm of your heartbeat echoes the rhythm of the tides. The salt in your tears matches the salt in seawater. You are, quite literally, the ocean walking on land, thinking, dreaming, wondering about where it came from and where it's going. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, you return to that ocean. Not physically, but spiritually. You dissolve back into the great current of existence. You become part of the eternal cycle of water and life and consciousness. You float in the warm, dark womb of the world, safe and supported, rocked by ancient rhythms older than memory. Tomorrow you'll wake, return to the surface, resume your individual identity and your daily concerns. But tonight you can rest in the oceanic consciousness that connects all things, that knows no boundaries between self and other, that experiences the world as a unified whole rather than a collection of separate parts. This is what the legend of Lemuria truly offers us. Not a historical fact about a sunken continent, but a metaphorical truth about human unity, about our common origin and our shared destiny, about the deep connections that bind us together across oceans and centuries, about the eternal human project of making meaning from chaos and finding home in a universe that cares nothing for our existence. We care. That's what makes us human. We care about the past and the future, about truth and beauty, about connection and meaning. And in that caring, we create the very things we seek: the meaning, the connection, the beauty, not given to us by the universe, but created by us within the universe. Lemuria is our creation, our gift to ourselves, our way of saying that the past matters, that memory persists, that lost things can be mourned and honored, even if they can't be recovered, that humans are capable of building wonders and surviving catastrophes and preserving what's important across unimaginable spans of time. Whether or not a continent called Lemuria ever existed beneath the Pacific, the idea of Lemuria exists in our minds and hearts. And that's enough. That's everything. Because we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. We are matter contemplating matter. We are the ocean dreaming about the ocean. And in that dreaming, we create reality. Not the physical reality of continents and oceans, but the psychological reality of meaning and connection, the spiritual reality of belonging and purpose, the emotional reality of loss and hope. Good night from Simply About Earth. Sleep well, dream of oceans, dream of lost lands and found meaning. Dream of the great mystery that we are, and the greater mystery we're part of. Dream of waves and stars, and the eternal story of existence unfolding moment by moment into an unknowable future. The Pacific keeps its secrets, and tonight, so do you. Rest now in the depths of your own being, in the quiet place where wonder lives, where questions don't need answers and mysteries don't need solutions. Tomorrow is for seeking and striving. Tonight is for floating and dreaming, for dissolving back into the undifferentiated consciousness from which we all emerge, and to which we all return. The waves whisper their ancient song, the stars shine their ancient light, and you are part of that ancient unbroken chain of being that stretches from the first spark of life in Earth's primordial oceans to this present moment of consciousness and wonder. You are Lemuria, the lost continent that never was and always will be, the mythical homeland that exists not in space but in time, not in the Pacific but in the human heart, not in the past but in the eternal present of imagination and memory. Sleep well, dreamer. The ocean awaits you in your dreams. Good night.